Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. My job today is to read out Dr. Riyad Asfat's paper that he's prepared for us very kindly. It's the second paper that he's prepared for this module. The first was quite extraordinary on the Awqaf. I recommend you to study that, those of you who weren't at the first part of the module. He's also the author of Economics,
Justice and Sharia
in Islam. Economics, Justice and Sharia in Islam, published by Medina Press from a thesis submitted to the University of Melbourne. And he's also just recently completed his PhD for the same university. Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the Civilization and Society program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the 10th of 12 sessions which make up the question concerning economics module. The lecture will last approximately 40 minutes, during which time you should make a written note of any questions that may occur to you for clarification after the lecture. The title of the lecture is Mu'amalat as the Way Forward. This paper is divided into 3 parts. The first part will investigate how mu'amalat was understood and practiced in the pre- and early modern period. The second part will survey what happened to the practice of mu'amalat in the modern period. And finally, we will look at mu'amalat as the way forward. Prior to discussing these 3 aspects, we will define what mu'amalat are. Mu'amalat means bilateral transactions in all spheres of life, be they social, economic, spiritual, or political. So bilateral, there are 2 parties involved. The application of the law, that is the fiqh, with regards to mu'amalat, aims at regulating the conduct of people amongst themselves. Although the writings of Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, and At-Tabari refer to mu'amalat as the determination of trade transactions and credit operations, we need to remember that marriage, divorce, inheritance, etc. also constitute mu'amalat. Mu'amalat must in fact be viewed as one aspect of a unified whole which includes Aqidah, Sharia, and Tasawwuf. These are the 3 elements of the deen that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke of in the famous hadith of Jibreel recorded in the Sahih of Imam Muslim. The fiqh of mu'amalat is part of the corpus of fiqh that regulates all aspects of a Muslim's life. Imam Malik encapsulated the relation of outward behavior to the inner state of the human being when he said, "Whoever takes on tasawwuf without taking fiqh becomes heretical, and whoever takes on fiqh without taking tasawwuf becomes a transgressor. Only he who combines the 2 will attain to the truth." There is no distinction between ibadat and mu'amalat. The distinctions that certain jurists have made are illusory and not substantive. Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, for example, said, "Permissible earning is in the category of cooperation in acts of devotion and obedience." In other words, it's a kind of ibadah. Imam al-Ghazali linked the acquisition of material wealth with success in the hereafter when he said, "Indeed, those who seek the world in order to be assisted by it towards attaining to the afterlife, how could they disregard the profit of the afterlife when the market and the mosque and the home are for them governed by one law, and salvation is only through taqwa?" So we will look at mu'amalat as understood and practiced in the pre- and early modern period. In the pre- and early modern period, the institutions of Muslim society were intact, and it was within these institutions that the mu'amalat were practiced, and around them that the society functioned. These institutions were the market, hisbah, meaning the office of the muhtasib, law courts that adjudicated Islamic business contracts, the guilds, the mint, and the Bait al-Mal, or treasury. Taking first the market, Souq refers to both the place where commercial transactions take place and the commercial exchange of goods and services itself. Markets existed long before the Prophet's experience of them in Mecca and Medina, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam propagated his message in the marketplace, much to the dismay of the Quraysh. And after capturing Mecca, he appointed Sa'id ibn al-As as Amil as-Suq. This is he called the proto-muhtasib, means also like the governor, the one responsible for the governance of the market. A woman named Samra bint Nuhayk al-Asadiyah was employed in this post by the Prophet ﷺ in Medina. Ash-Shifa bint Abdullah, also a woman, was employed in Medina by Umar ibn al-Khattab for the same task some time later. The market was an open space, situated adjacent to the mosque, and no buildings were to be constructed in it. Prefacing his comments on the market and referring to the Islamic scholars of the early period, Ghazanfar points out that, consistent with the tenor of the time, economics did not dominate their writings, though some Islamic scholars did write specifically on economic issues. All discourses during this era reflected a unified, holistic approach to knowledge pursued with a teleological orientation, with salvation as the supreme objective of human endeavors. He summarizes certain key market-oriented characteristics as to the functioning of economic business activities that are found in the writings of Abu Yusuf al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah as follows. 1. Markets evolve as part of the natural order of things in an interdependent, competitive environment. 2. Demand and supply forces are fundamental determinants of prices. 3. Greed in human affairs is shunned and profits are not to be excessive. 4. While economic pursuits are part of one's divinely ordained duty, calling, the production of necessities is specifically viewed as socially obligatory. 5. A society's welfare function is defined in terms of a tripartite hierarchy of mutually reinforcing individual and social utilities, necessities, conveniences or comforts, and refinements or luxuries. 6. Money as a medium of exchange evolves as a social necessity, for without it, barter results in problems such as lack of a common denominator, of the double coincidence of wants, and lack of indivisibility. And hoarding of money for its own sake is against divine rules, as would be counterfeiting and debasement. Further, as with the Judeo-Christian tradition, usury is sinful, for money in itself is useless and sterile. The economic principles outlined above had the force of law behind them. The Caliph, the Emirs, the judiciary, and the Muhtasibs were responsible for their practical implementation. Much of the administration was the duty of the Muhtasib. For example, the giving of full measure and weight, proscribing fraudulent business practices, ensuring the legality of contracts, prohibiting improper gain like riba, and arbitrary manipulation of the market like hoarding of necessities. This raises the question of the legal powers of the Muhtasib. Al-Mawardi wrote, Al-Mawardi was an early Shafi'i faqih. He lived at the time of the Abbasids, and he wrote a book that Dr. Asadullah Yek translated called Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyah, which is all the matters referring to Islamic governance. It is pretty much marked by the stamp of the Abbasid Dawla. It has the ethos of the Abbasid Dawla, but it's still a useful reference word. He wrote that it must be appreciated that Hisbah lies between the activity of the judiciary of the Qadi and that of the investigation of complaints and abuse. And this, although the Arabic is not given, I imagine he's referring to Radd al-Madhalim. So there needs to be an office in the society where people who've been done an injury by an Amir or by a Qadi, they can go with their complaints. Unless the Muhtasib is part of the judiciary, he may only adjudicate in cases concerning cheating and deceit in sales and prices, concerning short measure and underweight, and concerning repayment of debts. This short list should not lead one to assume that the power wielded by the Muhtasib was insignificant. On the contrary, he exercised enormous power in preventing objectionable practices. The objectionable practices are divided into those pertaining to the mosque, the markets, the public highways, the public baths, in hospitality, and those in general. So we often tend to mistakenly think of the Muhtasib as only concerned with the market, but he was concerned with public life in general. Finally, there is the matter of ordering the political leaders to do good and forbidding them from evil. Governance of the city is the responsibility of the Muhtasib. Hisbah, or public order, relates to the Quranic injunction, and so there must be from amongst you a group who calls to the best and commands the good and forbids what is bad. So on the understanding that this refers to one group among the Muslims rather than the Muslims themselves, then this is sometimes restricted to the activity of the Muhtasib. Although this applies to every Muslim, the Muhtasib is obliged to do so because of his appointment by the Caliph. He cannot transfer this obligation to another, and people must have recourse to him with regards to their complaints. Under the Umayyads, the Caliphs or their governors carried out this function themselves. It was under the Abbasids that it became established as a separate institution. The Muhtasib has to investigate unacceptable behavior in order to discourage it and renew good behavior that has been abandoned. He may have assistance in order to discharge his duties more efficiently, and he receives a stipend from the Bait al-Mal for his services. He may impose punishments for misdemeanors as long as they do not exceed the limits set for the had punishment. The had punishments being specific fixed penalties laid down in the Sharia. This type of punishment is called ta'azir. It may not exceed the had punishment, and it may not, and some people consider it may not equal the had punishment. Although the Muhtasib has certain judicial powers, these are conditional. The Muhtasib is expected to be just and of sound judgment. If his appointment includes the power to compel others through his own ijtihad and judgment, he must be a mujtahid. If that is not part of his brief, he should nevertheless be aware of the legality of the disputed matters. The task of the Muhtasib covers all spiritual, political, and economic considerations and reflects the unity that Islam has always sought to achieve between the ma'ash and the ma'ad. These two terms we heard yesterday, the Muslim's material and spiritual life. It is customary to divide the Muhtasib's duties into two categories. The first, those relating to the spiritual life of the city, some of which include the arrangements for the Friday prayer, the Eid prayer, the 5 daily prayers, the adhan at the time of prayers, maintenance of mosques and public baths. The second category of his duties deals with the physical environment of the city, the heart of which is the market, and comprehensively covers trade and commerce. In this sense, he is also the ombudsman charged with the responsibility to guarantee that all goods and services that enter the marketplace are good for society and the environment. His economic functions included, first, ensuring the supply of necessities, foodstuffs, etc. Secondly, supervision of industry, product standardization, arbitration, minimum wages, etc. 3. Supervision of services, professional services, medical practitioners, pharmacologists, teachers, etc. 4. Supervision of trading practices, weights and measures, product quality, enforcing laws against forbidden practices, etc. 5. Civil and municipal functions, public safety, business locations, even enforcing anti-pollution rules. Supply, he now works through these things. Supply and provision of necessities include water distribution in the city, upkeep and cleanliness of the streets, prevention of overcrowding, observation of funerals, prohibition of funeral songs and lamentations, and vigilance against the desecration of graves and maintenance of buildings. Supervision of industry meant overseeing the quality of manufacture and workmanship of the many different trades. Goitain points out that the Cairo Geniza records show the vast number of occupations and the high degree of specialization and division of labor apparent in them.
It's a Jewish record,
The Geniza.
I think so, yeah. Of Cairo.
Ah. There were about 265 manual occupations, 90 types of person engaged in commerce, and approximately the same number of professionals, officials, religious functionaries, and educators. This total of around 450 professions exceeds by far the listed professions for all other pre-modern cities. These records of commercial documents are from the Fatimid and Abuyyid periods, the 10th to the 13th centuries, when Cairo was one of the world's most prominent economic, political, and cultural centers. Supervision of services meant that the muhtasib was in charge of examining the following professionals: physicians, atibba; pharmacists, soyadila; perfumers, attarun; syrup manufacturers, sharabiyun; cuppers, hajjamun; bloodletters, fasadun; oculists, kaharun; surgeons and orthopedists, jarrahun and mujabbirun. The civil and municipal duties of the muhtasib with regards to trade and commerce included the maintenance of the markets, free access to public thoroughfares, that they are not invaded by merchants' booths, public safety and hygiene, contamination of foodstuff, pollution, supervision of trading practices, control of weights and measures, coinage, the monitoring of fraudulent transactions, unlawful sales and collusion, and elimination of riba in all its guises. The muhtasib had to see to it that illegal and fraudulent sales transactions were punished. Now we move on to the law courts and business contracts. The judiciary, whilst relying on the political authorities to execute their judgments, was nevertheless responsible for ensuring justice in relation to wealth, property, trade, and commerce, together with all other matters relating to the society. As a compendium of Islamic law, the Muwatta includes the Book of Business Transactions, the Book of Sharecropping, the book of renting land, and the book of judgments. Judgments in general were expected to be given in accordance with the opinion of the madhab to which the judge belonged. It was not necessary for the qadi to belong to the same juridical school as the person who appointed him, but he could be directed to follow a certain school when adjudicating in a certain case. In practice, however, the political authorities preferred qadis of their own juridical school. Under the Abbasids, this was at first the Hanafi and later on the Shafi'i. Under the Ottomans, most decidedly the Hanafi, whereas under the Umayyads of Spain, the Maliki school had a jealously guarded monopoly. In the interest of the populace, allowance was made for the adherents of different schools. For example, in 1131 in Cairo, several judges belonging to different schools were appointed, from among whom the parties could choose freely. Beginning with the Abbasids, the judge of the capital occupied a prominent position and was given the title of Qadi al-Qudat, the chief judge, or literally the judge of judges. He supervised the judiciary, and the first to occupy this position was Abu Yusuf, co-founder of the Hanafi madhab under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, as we mentioned yesterday with Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. Here we will look at some examples of Islamic partnerships and commercial contracts. Qirad or Mudaraba. Wealth provided by an investor in the trust of an agent for commercial purposes, the agent receiving no wage but taking a previously agreed share of the profits after the capital has first been paid back to the investor. Sharikat are profit-sharing partnerships between two or more partners. There are several different sharika partnerships available. Sharika al-A'mal or al-Abdan, labor partnership based on the partner's work. Sharika al-Aqd, contractual partnership. And Sharika al-Mal, finance partnership based on the partner's contribution of money. Sharika al-Mulk, proprietary partnership, concerned with the ownership of something. Sharika fil bay', the transfer at cost price of goods from one partner to another, who then becomes a partner in those goods and agrees to sell it for both of them. The profit is then shared between them. Sharika wujuh, credit partnership. Further, after Sharika, then there is the contract of Murabaha, which is partnership between an investor and entrepreneur, in which the investor buys equipment, goods or commodities to resell to the entrepreneur at a markup which is predetermined and fixed. Ijara, a contract in which the leaseholder pays for the temporary use of a house, beast or piece of equipment for a specific period of time and stipulated hire charge. Musaqa, crop sharing, tending to an existing plantation in exchange for a share of the yield. So it's an agreement between the owner of the plantation and somebody who works it for him. Muzara'a, farming partnership in which the owner of land allows the land to be cultivated in exchange for a portion of the produce. Salam, a sale in which the price is paid at once for goods to be delivered later. Ownership passes to the buyer as soon as the contract is made and the delivery date is specified. turn to craft, artisan, and trade guilds. They were variably known as Osnaf, Ta'ifa, and Futuwa in the Muslim world. The guilds were integrated into an economic milieu that included the professions, markets, and physical localization of each profession in their own quarters in the market. Economic activity varied according to the size and importance of each city. Cairo contained more than 200 guilds and 435 professions. Court records of Damascus and Aleppo in the 16th and 17th centuries show that between 160 and 180 guilds brought cases to the courts. This figure does not indicate the actual number of guilds that existed in these cities. Guilds were autonomous organizations in which members of the same craft got together, elected a head, a sheikh, from among their ranks, and appeared in the law court to have their nominee endorsed by a qadi. Rafiq notes that the fatwa, or legal opinions, of the Syrian qadis during the 17th, 18th, and 19th century indicate that the crafts and craftsmen were regulated by the Sharia. The muhtasib supervised the guilds, checking on weights, measures, quality, and prices. The internal organization of the Ottoman guilds had two aspects: administrative and professional. The professional ranks were apprentice, al-ajir or al-mubtadi, the journeyman, as-sani', and the master, al-mu'allim or al-ustadh. Administrative officials included the sheikh al-mashayikh, the sheikh, the naqib, the yikit bashi, the mu'arif, and the chawush. Lewis says that the Islamic guilds displayed four distinctive qualities. They developed spontaneously from the craftsmen themselves and not in response to state needs. Number two, the masters, journeymen, and apprentices did not develop into different economic and social classes. 3, membership was not restricted to Muslims. 4, they possessed an inner spiritual life. The guilds provide a good example of how the political, economic, social, and spiritual dimensions of human nature are welded together. Guild members are reminded to close 7 doors: avarice, violence, envy, worldly pleasures, reliance on men, vain speech, and evil deeds. And to open 7 doors: generosity, kindness, contentment, ascetic discipline, trust in Allah, glorification of Allah, and readings from the Quran and pious deeds. Moreover, they were not to disobey, not to hate, not to cover up the errors of others, and to earn one's living by carrying on a trade, not for personal enrichment, but for a modest life with support for the poor and needy, etc. Shkodra states that the guilds formed the dominant economic and social institutions in the Balkans, and Rafiq notes that the stability of the economic and social life in Syria can be attributed to the guilds. This is a quote from him: "For the craftsmen, the ta'ifas ensured an organized way of work, a balanced income, a minimum of competition, and more important, a high standard of work ethics cutting across religio-ethnic barriers. In short, the ta'ifas helped perpetuate the stability of the social and economic fabric of the country. 3 economic functions performed by the guilds are noteworthy here: inhibiting monopoly capitalism, providing social security, and protecting the integrity of the bimetallic currency. The use of debased coins was frowned upon as a grave sin, and their withdrawal from circulation was obligatory. Now we'll turn to the Bait al-Mal. This is literally the house of wealth, which institutionally developed to become the treasury of the Muslim state. The origin of this institution can be traced back to the Prophet ﷺ, when the revenues that came into it were distributed almost immediately. It maintained similar characteristics during the time of the first Caliph Abu Bakr, but developed into a complex institution in the time of the second Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, when huge amounts of wealth were acquired by Muslims after Persia, Syria, and Egypt were conquered by them. The revenue that went into the Bait al-Mal was from the following sources: zakat, number 2, kharaj, the tax on lands not confiscated from the inhabitants of conquered or surrendered lands; ghanima, booty captured from the enemy; 4, jizya, the poll tax taken from non-Muslims in the Muslim state; 5, ushur, 1/10 of the harvest of agricultural produce, 1/20 if the land has been irrigated by human endeavor. This properly belongs to the zakat. 5, properties with no known owner. 6, properties of apostates. 7, estates of deceased persons. 8, revenues from state lands. And 9, judicial fines. The state raised income for construction and maintenance of physical infrastructure and public works relating to land, water, and civilization through the taxes listed above. It must be noted, of course, that the zakat is obligatorily kept separate from the others and only goes to the categories delineated in the Quran. However, it has to be remembered that Islamic society was financed through the Waqf system. Huxter explains that prior to the 20th century, a broad spectrum of what we now designate as public or municipal services, for example, welfare, education, religious services, construction and maintenance of the water system, hospitals, etc., were set up, financed and maintained almost exclusively by endowments. Quran notes that waqfs supported so many economic sectors that the evolution of Islamic civilization is incomprehensible without taking account of them. The next institution is the mint. The minting of coins was the prerogative of the Caliph and a symbol of his authority.
Could you just repeat that sentence again, because we can't have that kind of if possible. Sorry.
The minting of coins was the prerogative of the Caliph and the symbol of his authority. In subsequent history, this right was exercised by governors as well. The currencies that the Muslims used in their commercial transactions were the gold dinar and silver dirham coins. The office of the mint was responsible for standardizing the quality of the coins and guarding against their falsification and clipping. So falsification, he's got here in brackets clipping. The ruler's mark on the coins indicated their good quality and purity. Sheikh Omar Vadio explains the significance of the dinar and dirham as follows. Islam has its own economic model. This model is not capitalist nor is it socialist. It stems from the Quran and the Sunnah. It has a history of 1,400 years from the beginning of Islam up until the dissolution of the Caliphate in the 20th century. This model protects and acknowledges private property as well as the property of Allah, the awqaf, and it is based on Islamic contractual law. The Islamic model uses physical commodities as money. The gold dinar and silver dirham are known as the Sharia currency. These two commodities, gold and silver, have a special status because they are mentioned in Quran and they are the measure for fundamental matters such as zakat and issues concerning hudud. The dinar and dirham are fundamental in preserving a stable currency. That is, currency that fluctuates in value but does not suffer inflation. It does not suffer inflation because it cannot be substituted by credit money, which is inflated, since credit money has no validity in Islamic law. So that broadly is the finish of the first part, which is an outline of muamalat in pre- and early modern societies, Muslim societies. And the second part is the extinction of the practice of muamalat in the modern period. In the modern period, first Christian and then Muslim modes of trade and commerce were replaced by capitalist means of production, distribution and consumption. Modernist Muslims have devised legal methodologies to justify involvement in the capitalist system. David Johnston, in an article entitled A Turn in the Epistemology and Hermeneutics of 20th Century Usul al-Fiqh, says, I argue here that an epistemological shift has taken place in the 20th century Usul al-Fiqh, away from the classical, orthodox, Ash'ari position in which the human mind simply discovers the divine law and extends it to new cases on the basis of consensus, ijma', and analogical reasoning, qiyas, and towards a position in which reason is empowered to uncover the ratio legis, the reason for the law behind the divine injunctions. This shift has been accompanied by a privileging of universal ethical principles, which are called in Arabic kulliyat, now identified as the aims of the law, maqasid al-sharia, over the specific injunctions of the text, which are juz'iyat. A hermeneutic strategy that has often favored public interest, maslaha, as the chief criterion for developing fresh legal rulings in the light of new socio-political conditions. The main theoreticians discussed here are Muhammad Abdu, Muhammad Rashid Rida, Abdul Razak Sanhuri, Abdul Wahab Khalaf, Muhammad Abu Zahra, and Muhammad Hashim Kamali. This is the end of the quote from David Johnston. Abdu had blamed the ulama for their impervious judicial outlook, which, in his words, fostered the misconception that Islam, by its very nature, is incapable of coping with the growing complexity of modern life, and Muslims had therefore to have recourse to foreign laws. Abdu's methodology called for a return to the original sources of the law. He claimed that this was necessary in order to liberate thought from the shackles of taqlid and thereby unleash the ability for exercising ijtihad. Taqlid is referred to pejoratively by him as blind imitation and involves the unquestioning and uncritical conformity with decisions made by past mujtahids. In order to bring out the latent dynamism of the Sharia, Abdu promoted istislah, public interest, and talfiq, legal eclecticism. In other words, joining rulings from the different madhabs, and in fact from people beyond the madhabs. Rida went further and spoke of the need for ishtira, legislation. Ishtira, legislation. He takes the division that the Sharia makes between ibadat, devotional and ritual acts, and mu'amalat, social transactions, and proposes legislation in the mu'amalat. All administrative, juridical, political, and military acts are therefore subject to man-made legislation. Rida claimed that the foundation of his methodology leads to legal dynamism. The evidence, however, indicates that contrary to his claim, this methodology ends up in the abandonment of Islamic law. With regards to the Egyptian reformers, which include Abdu and Rida, Laish points out that their legal reforms are deliberately secular legislative acts which were carried out in a traditional medium but outside Islamic law. He contends that although the source of inspiration for the reforms is in the West, technical resemblance to the ijtihad may create the illusion that they are an internal overhaul of the Sharia. Let me read that again. He contends that although the source of inspiration for the reforms is in the West, technical resemblance to the ijtihad may create the illusion that they are an internal overhaul of the Sharia. Rida's thinking promoted secularism, constitutionalism, democracy, legislation, and capitalism. Rida was the conduit linking the ideas of Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and his disciple Abdu to Hassan al-Banna, who went on to become the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin. In her book entitled An Islamic Response to Imperialism, Keddy has shown that the aim of al-Afghani was to subvert the Islamic ethos. The method that the modernists use in order to achieve their goal is called Islah, which is the Arabic term for reform. Reform calls for new interpretations of Islam due to changing historical and social realities. In Islamic legal terms, this process would come under the rubric of ijtihad. Reform, they say, has to be achieved through changes in the laws of Islam. The legal techniques used by the religious reformers for effecting changes in law were maslaha, considerations of public interest, and siyasa shar'iyya, administrative regulations. The stated objective of the modernists is to rid the Muslim Ummah of a centuries-long mentality of taqlid, blind imitation, and jumud, stagnation, to restore Islam to its pristine form and to reform the moral, cultural, and political conditions of Muslims. End of quote. They also claimed that they desired to free Muslims from political despotism and foreign domination. Despite making these claims, the reality is that the modernists accept the entire political and economic methodology of democracy and capitalism. Their political philosophy includes such Western concepts as statism, nationalism, constitutionalism, democracy, parliamentarism, capitalism, banking, the International Monetary System, and the United Nations Organization. It should be noted here that these concepts are commonly accepted by Sunni, Shi'i, and Wahhabi modernists. There is a considerable philosophical and political affinity between them. All modernists, through their principle of reformism, played a major role in the secularization of Islamic law. The net result of this Islamization process was that capitalism and the modern state did not become Islamized. On the contrary, the Muslim countries and people continued to modernize and continued to be incorporated into the global capitalist network. The way forward, muamalat as the way forward. The way forward is through action with regards to trade and commerce. This will be done through the establishment of the muamalat network. The network aims to create self-employment through partnerships in businesses and to attract investments for the setting up of these business enterprises. The network will provide training, mentoring, and auditing for the businesses established under its supervision. The services provided by the network will include Islamic partnerships and commercial contracts, training, guild development, markets, wakalas. Training will cover the following areas: muamalat in the Quran and Sunnah, the fiqh of trade and commerce, partnerships and commercial contracts, markets and muhtasibs, currencies and wakalas, caravans, how to join a guild and manufacture or procure a product or provide a service, awqaf, plans to sell your product or services, pricing, costing, break-even and budgeting, selling your product, marketing, commercial law, bookkeeping, auditing, legal and administrative requirements for business, expanding business, international trade. And this is a project that Dr. Riyad is working upon at the moment, is to bring about the muamalat network. It represents, I would say, a lifelong desire and ambition of his, that now that he's concluded his academic studies, he's working to set this up. Of course, this will be in Australia, and if he can find suitable partners in other countries, then he can extend this operation further, inshallah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وسلم تسليما والحمد لله رب العالمين.